How did Black military service shape the civil rights movement? I study the causes and consequences of racial discrimination, and one of my current research projects is really thinking about the historical origins of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was one of the most consequential social movements in U.S. history, paved the way for landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, etc., that have really shaped multiracial democracy and representation in America. What we focused on in this paper is really thinking about the role of Black veterans in the civil rights movement and really thinking about how their experiences in the military informed their decision to fight for racial equality afterwards. What we've done is really focused on World War I, which was the first war in which we had a draft that included African Americans in this country, ultimately led to close to 400,000 Black men serving in the National Army. There's just a trove of information about these individuals that exists in various repositories that have been digitized at this point. And so we have close to 1 million draft registration cards for every Black man who registered for the first World War I draft. And we're able to link those individuals and trace their lives and follow them over time by matching those draft cards to a number of other historical detailed records, things like the census, things like detailed service and military records, and even things like membership rosters for the NAACP, which continues to be one of the most prominent civil rights organizations today and was then as well. What we then use is the random variation that comes from a draft lottery. So what happened in World War I and happened in World War II as well, in the Vietnam War, is that men who registered were essentially randomly picked to serve in the military. And so that gives us a way of looking at the causal impact of serving in the military, of military service, on post-war outcomes. Using the draft lottery, we then find that these Black men who were randomly enlisted and conscripted into the military, relative to other Black men who were observably similar, from similar hometowns, the same hometown in many cases, the Black men who were drafted were about 3 times more likely to then take part in the NAACP. They're also about 3 times more likely to end up being known as a prominent civic leader during this very sort of vibrant era of Black collectivism, Black identity. What were the aspects of serving in the military, of their experiences, their lived experiences in the military, in being drafted, etc., that caused them to take part? What we find was a pretty stark and striking pattern. So during World War I, the military was racially segregated. Black men, even highly educated Black men, were often relegated to sort of roles as menial laborers. They were often denied many of the opportunities and training opportunities and promotion opportunities that their white counterparts would have been afforded. And we're able to sort of back out how much discrimination someone experienced in the military, because a lot of this varied based on what particular camp or what particular unit you happen to be sent to. And what we find across every measure that we have of these different experiences of discrimination, whether it's going to a camp in which Black men were denied officerships, or going to a camp in which Black men were denied training opportunities, across all of those different outcomes, we find that it's really the Black men who experienced the most discrimination while serving their country who were then, after the war, much more likely to take part in the NAACP. We also find evidence that it's individuals who are coming, for example, from more northern areas in the United States, areas that are outside of the former Confederacy, areas that you might think of as experiencing less racism outside the military. Black men who are drafted from those areas were then also much more likely to take part in the NAACP relative to Black men who were drafted from areas that were more historically racist. And so I think it speaks to this idea that some of what's activating this civic activism and civic engagement, this desire to fight for racial equality, is its exposure to discrimination, its exposure to institutionalized racism that these men were experiencing once they got to the military. There is evidence, even if you go further back, that Black soldiers who served for the Union during the Civil War were more likely to perhaps become prominent civic leaders in the early Jim Crow era. Part of the issue with thinking about that, though, is that during the Civil War, Black men weren't required to register. They weren't citizens in a sense, and so they couldn't be drafted or conscripted in that way. And so thinking about the types of people who would choose to join the Army, you can imagine that those individuals might have a stronger civic spirit or a more desire to fight for change to begin with. And that's sort of what's driving their post-war involvement in politics, or how much of this is driven by some intrinsic sense of duty, perhaps that these men felt, or of injustice that these men felt, versus how much of it is coming through this experience of having served in the military, of having fought or been trained. That's the tricky thing in terms of thinking about what are the causal drivers of what we're seeing. By looking at World War I, we're much more able to disentangle those things because there was this random forcing function in terms of whether or not someone actually served in the military, and that was the draft lottery. A lot of civic historians have done really amazing qualitative work trying to piece together some of the narratives and perceptions and feelings that very prominent Black civic activists and civic leaders have experienced and what catalyzed them. That being said, not everybody gets a biography written about them. Not everybody is able to sort of record these things in various books or have that recorded by others. And so what we're trying to do in this paper is really just take a really comprehensive, really holistic stance of all these men and really understand what was the contribution of all Black World War I veterans, of all Black draft registrants, in terms of their contribution to the civil rights movement, what led them to make those contributions, and how does it align with some of the stories that we've heard through these biographies, that we've heard through these perhaps better known narratives.